for tuning in today. It's a great topic today. Love talking about compost, one of my favorite things, and really one of the most important things when it comes to gardening. I mean, there's very few other things that affect us like as much like us gardeners as composting does, and the compost that we get. We are pretty lucky here in the Okanagan. We can actually purchase compost. It's available in a bunch of different forms, so we'll talk a little bit about that today. We're going to talk a little bit about soils, and we're going to talk about what the soil makeup is, and we're going to talk about what the relationship between plants and soils and water and all that stuff are, and then how to actually do a compost and what makes a compost really great. So that's what we're going to do today. So I'm just going to get right at it. Right now, it looks like we're right on time. Okay, so topic number one today we're going to cover is soil. And soil is really the key thing that when we deal with any kind of gardens, especially vegetable gardening. So with vegetable gardening, it's just critical that we have really good, healthy soil. So when we talk about soil health, what do we mean by that? Well, it means we have a certain balance of the makeup of the soil, but we have that beautiful compost in that soil mixture. So what we need to know, first of all, and hopefully you guys can see my board here, and we just have to figure out what is the soil made up of, what are the components that we deal with when it comes to garden soil. And we're going to talk predominantly about, say, vegetable soil, or maybe we'd say perennial plant soil, or a little bit higher quality soil. It's important to note that when you're building anything, if you're building a landscape or something, and say you go out in your backyard and you start digging away, and then you look and see what you have for soil, and you look and see that you have pretty kind of rotten soil. Maybe it's pure silt or pure sand or something. And you have to make a decision if you're going to amend that soil and make it better, or are we going to select plants that actually like those conditions? So we have that option. Here in the Okanagan, where we're working, it's kind of a semi-arid desert here, so our soils have less than 1% organic matter typically. We have soils that are predominantly either one thing or the other, but generally not a mixture. So when you start mixing all the components of soils together, you end up with loamy soil, and that's where that term loam comes from. So the mineral content of soil is sand, silt, and clay, and those particles are all mineral. So those are all really just sizes of particles. So we're talking about sand as being the larger particles, and you could even classify that up as big as like a fairly large granule, which it could be a fair size. There's actually a range. Once it gets over a certain size, they call it gravel. And then gravel, plants like gravelly soils. They like gritty soils. They like to root through gritty soils. There's lots of space for roots to grow. So they like that kind of thing. But sand is one of the key things. When you do have soils that are sandy, you're going to find they're going to warm up really quickly in the spring. They're going to be really, really easy to amend. They're not going to hold organic matter very long. The organic matter will tend to break down really quickly, and we'll talk about that today. So silt is a fine product. It's actually similar in a lot of ways to sand, but it's very, very fine. The particles are just barely visible, and this is what I often classify as the dust that you'll see when it gets really dry out, and you'll see these areas that's just kind of clouds of dusty soils. And that dust itself is usually silt, and that's what blows around. So again, it's a mineral base, and then clay particles are so tiny, they're microscopic. And they're actually, the only way you can actually see them is with an electron microscope. And clay forms together so tightly that there's no air particles in it typically. But the clay is so tiny, it's electrically charged. It has generally a negative electrical charge. And so what it does is it attracts things and it holds on to things, particularly nutrients. So I actually like to have some clay in my soil, and you'll find that when you have clay, you always have lots of nutrients. So plants actually like clay as well. The problem is that plants need oxygen in their root system in order to grow and be healthy. Most plants anyway. So clay is one of these things that's kind of something you need it's best in sort of smaller quantities. If you have just solid clay, well, then you have a pottery shop probably. It's a little difficult to work with clay sometimes. So, so sand, silt, and clay, that's your minerals. OM, we just say that's organic matter. So organic matter could be pretty much anything that's a compostable item. But remember that even things like wood is actually an organic matter, where it's actually very, very slow and hard to decompose. So sand, silt, clay, organic matter, life. So soils are full of life. There's all kinds of insects and worms and microbes and all kinds of living things in soil. And it's quite an amazing thing once you start to see how much life there actually is. And when you look at organic soils, like say stuff you'd see in your vegetable garden, very, very high amount of bacteria in there. And the majority of those are all beneficial bacteria. As much as I've heard that up to 4 billion bacteria in a cubic centimeter of soil. And that's amazing if you think about that for a second. Like the earth is alive, it's a living thing. And this is what plants are used to though, right? This is normal for plants. So we've got the life part, all the organisms that are living in there. Then we have water, which is a key important thing to plants because that dissolves the nutrients and allows the plants to absorb it, as well as keeps the plants turgid. And of course, turgor pressure, that's the water pressure within the plant. And it actually transmits all those nutrients and actually helps keep the plant cool and circulates water through the plant. So water is key to plant survival. And then gases. So the gas is usually oxygen is the number one, but roots give off a lot of carbon dioxide as well. And so what we need to do is we want to make sure that the earth is breathing a bit to sort of get rid of some of that carbon dioxide and allow oxygen to come in. And that's one of the key things with soil, is to have these pore spaces in between each clump of soil, where when you put water in, the water trickles down in between these pores, and then it actually sucks in, like it's almost like percolating, it sucks in, creates a vacuum, and it sucks in fresh air in behind it. And that's what keeps roots healthy. So you'll often see people planting plants and they're stomping on the plants and packing them into the ground, and they really don't realize it, that they're squeezing all the oxygen, all the air out of the soil. And it's really not a good thing for plants. So air is critical, and when you dig up soil and you loosen it up, you get all those nice air spaces in there. And then when you water, the water trickles through and pulls fresh air in behind it. And that's critical for roots. And it's number one thing for plants and plant roots, and something you can take from this session today is about how important oxygen is for the roots. It's just an absolutely critical thing. Roots cannot survive without oxygen. That being said, that there are certain species of plants that have learned and have adapted to growing in heavy clay soils, but you definitely have to select those plants specifically. If you have an area where it's heavy soil, you want to pick from a proven list of plants that will live in that type of soil where it's low oxygen, but the roots are particularly strong at pushing through clay soils. So sand is really great because it's got lots of oxygen, but a lot of the nutrients and things just wash away. So when you start mixing these things all together and you get this mixture, they call it loam. And there's different types of loam, of course. There's sandy loams or silty loams or clay loams. So those loam soils are, if they use the word sandy on it or sandy, it's predominantly sandy. If it's a silt loam, silty loam, it's predominantly silt, and so on. Clay loams are predominantly clay. And so just a standard loam would be somewhere in between, where you'd have maybe a 40-40-20 sort of mixture would be like a standard loam. And then organic matter is always a benefit, but remember, there's no stability in organic matter. And that's one of the key things whenever you're building a lawn or something. If you put too much organic matter into your lawn, all the microbes in the earth will just consume all that organic matter, and it'll just disappear. So everything will just go soft. It'll shrink right down and be gone within a short period of time. And all that will be left is the sand, silt, and clay. So you will find that when people are building lawns, particularly professionals, they want to use a sandy loam to start with, because the sand will never break down. It's going to be stable for a long period of time, and it's always going to let oxygen into the root system, and it lets water in as well. So really important. So again, the life is one of these things that's really important. So with microorganisms that live in the earth, root systems have become accustomed to having those around. The majority of them are beneficial. There's always the occasional insect or something that might get in and, like a grub or something that might eat the roots of a plant. But we consider that all organisms in the earth are really beneficial. And one of the, what's number one on the list? Worms, of course. So why are worms so great? Because the worms will burrow in and they make these little tunnels down into the earth, and they actually will consume organic matter. They'll often take organic matter off the surface, and then they'll go down into the ground, and then they cast that into the earth through worm castings, which really helps to fertilize the earth. But these little passageways are key to allow oxygen into the root system of the plants. That's what's great about worms. Oxygen. It's really critical. So I don't like to ever deter worms. I want to encourage them. And if you ever just put compost on the surface of the ground anywhere and just lift up that pile of compost, and you'll see the worms are under there eating that product. So we'll talk more about worms as we go along. In this session today, we only have just a short period of time. It's only really about 45 to 50 minutes, and we do a question and answer period at the end of it. But it's pretty amazing how much stuff you can actually cover. We could just do a whole session just on worms, but today we're going to try to touch on everything, but particularly compost is number one. So again, oxygen, we talked about that. That's really, really important. But ultimately, what is composting? So what composting is where you take organic matter, or let's say the refuse of plant material, and you allow it to be consumed, or even promote the consumption of these products, these leaf and foliage products. We allow them to be consumed by microbes or even other insects and worms and things like that. So when you have leftover compost, the more it's shredded up to start with, the faster it breaks down, the faster it composts. There's two types of composting that we talk about, which are the key sort of parts that we want to figure out here. Is that there's the oxygenated form, which is the active composting, and that's where we're actually stirring up the compost and we're adding oxygen into that compost. And then there's also the what we call passive composting, and that's where we put compost in a pile and we just let it sit for a long period of time. So when that sits and sits and sits, it slowly starts to break down, and molds and things start to move in. So active composting, where we're flushing in oxygen and a little bit of moisture, that's predominantly bacteria that's causing that to break down. There's fungus in there too, but we're really stimulating bacterial action in most compost systems. And those bacteria need oxygen to survive. So that's why we oxygenate it. We always add air into it. On the other hand, the passive composting is where we just put it in a pile and we leave it and we don't disturb it much. And then fungus comes in, and things that mold or rot, those things will move in and they will start to rot it and break it down. It takes longer, but the finished product can be really nice. And we'll talk about that today too. So I have those two different ways that I compost. And when I do compost actively, I want to have a lot of green material in there, because green is nitrogen. And that's another thing we're going to focus on today, is about how green parts of plants have a lot of nitrogen in them, and that's what the bacteria are after. They're going in there to consume the nitrogen. So when they consume nitrogen, it creates heat, and it really breaks it down really fast. And as it warms up too, the bacteria often multiply. And so the whole thing can just melt before your eyes. If there's a lot of nitrogen in there, you really get a nice composting effect. So you get nitrogen, a little bit of moisture, and lots of oxygen, and voila, you've got this beautiful composting thing going on. So green is the key. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about that here just really quickly, because I have some samples here that I'm going to show you. And I mean, these are fairly obvious samples. And I'm just going to hold this up here in front of the camera. And it's just this is a dried up leaf. This leaf is about a year old. And there's just another example of how dry that is. And these guys are just laying around on the surface of the ground, so they've had a lot of oxygen, but they haven't had much moisture. I brought some green leaves just to see the difference. So the green leaves I can compost actively by putting it into my compost pile and just turning it in. And these guys, because they're green, they're full of nitrogen, the bacteria will come in and start consuming these things. So really great active composting product. These guys are mostly carbon. There's really not much in there for nitrogen anymore, even though these are from last year. So we're in September now, so these are from last October. And these things are mostly pretty much all carbon. There's no nitrogen left. So the bacteria are not really interested in consuming this. The bacteria, they want the green leaves. So what do we do with these guys? Well, with these guys, at the end of each season, we get all these leaves and we're wondering what to do with them. Well, I like to do a passive composting with these. And that's just where I build a big pile of leaves, or I might build a big cage of some sort, and I'll fill it up with leaves. And those leaves, because they're brown, they're not going to be a lot of bacterial action in there. It's going to be mostly fungus. So what do we do with fungus? Well, with fungus, you know what they like? Moisture, damp, dank, poor air circulation. You know, these are things that promote fungus. So that's what we want to do, is we want to have this in a situation where there's some moisture, so we might hose it down a little bit, keep it moist, but we don't want to disturb it, because we want the fungus to live in a nice, happy environment. And for them, it's dank, it's dead air, it's just stagnant. That's what fungus likes. So we use fungus to break down leaves. And that's called leaf mold once that ends up, and I'll show you some samples of that. So I almost feel like going out and harvesting a whole bunch of leaves off my trees so I can mix them with the carbon. So you might have heard of carbon-nitrogen ratios. And carbon-nitrogen ratios when it comes to composting is that you need about 1 part green to about up to 30 parts of brown. So anything that's brown that's lost its green color, there's not much nitrogen in it. Of course, you can always cheat if you want, because lots of people don't mind to cheat, but you can pick up just straight nitrogen from the garden center, pick up your either 2100 or 4600 straight nitrogen, and you can just blend that into your brown stuff, and that'll break that down in a hurry, because that's pure nitrogen, and stand back, it'll just melt it away. So the bacteria need to have nitrogen in order to break down carbon. So if we're going to use fungus, all we do is leave it. But if we're going to do regular composting, we need green in there. So you know how fast let's say lawn clippings break down. And that's kind of a cool thing. You go and mow the front lawn and you dump the lawn clippings out, and you come back like 15 minutes later and it's already getting hot. You come back an hour later and it is hot. You come back 2 hours later and it's starting to break down. It's because there's so many little pieces in there and lots of air porosity. There's lots of oxygen in there. But the leaf clippings, especially from lawns, are super high nitrogen. That's why people who mulch mow their lawns, they benefit from that, because the lawn is made of nitrogen. So, and lawns love to eat nitrogen or consume it. So why not mulch mow and put the green right back into the lawn, and it gives you a really nice finished product there, and the lawn just loves it. So really important just to note that. So when I'm building a compost pile and it's like, gee, it's not breaking down too much, and I start to get into it and I see there's woody branches in there, there's leaves left over from last year, there's maybe some brown grass or something. Like grass that's green is great, but grass that's brown needs a bunch of green mixed into it to break it down quicker. So the active composting is quite fast, and if you keep aerating, you've seen those tumblers before where people put their compost in a tumbler and they can just turn it. Well, that's the best way to aerate compost. So if you do have that, you can break compost down in just about 2 months. You've got a really nice finished product. But if you're going to do it on the ground, the key is having a fairly large bin. So some of the basics of building a compost bin are really just having a space that's big enough. It's always been said that they've done tests, you know, of how well each compost pile works and how quickly it breaks down, and sort of what's the best size to have a compost pile or compost heap. And there actually is this magical sort of size, and they found that about a 5-foot area, a 5-foot pile, so 5 foot by 5 foot by 5 feet high, is sort of the ideal size, and it could be bigger than that, but they don't really want it too much smaller than that. It still breaks down, but it doesn't break down quite right. It doesn't get hot enough to kill all the weed seeds and stuff and diseases that get into it. So as a farmer, you've got usually a lot of land, and you can have these bigger piles. And then, of course, if you can aerate it and turn it over once in a while, that really works too. For most backyard composting, you really want to have spaces about 4 feet by 4 feet, which seems to work about right. And if you can have a 3-bin system, that works really nicely as well. So 3 bins, each bin is 4 feet by 4 feet. You want lots of oxygen in there, so you don't want them really made of plastic, even though municipalities will supply you with these composting bins, and they're not really promoting that oxygenation that we're talking about, but you can get in there with these screw tools that you can screw into it and aerate them that way, and it works pretty well. So they're good. It's always good to have that than, say, you know, not composting at all. But these piles that we have, once we have the piles, we're good to go, and things will start happening. If it starts drying out on the top, like if you're starting to hear that sound, you know, the crunchiness of those leaves, well, you know that's too dry. It needs to have a little bit of moisture. But turning that pile over is how you do that. So when you have a 3-bin system, what you do is you put all your compostables into bin 1, and when the bin is pretty much full or close to it, you take that over and you dump it into bin 2, and then you start filling bin 1 again. And then when you get a decent pile in bin 1, you take bin 2, put it in bin 3, take bin 1, put it in bin 2, and start filling bin 1 again. So it's this churning over of the product. You still have to churn it in between. So it's always nice to be able to get in there and oxygenate it and spray it down with water. In the Okanagan, we don't usually have problems because we're a desert. You know, we're quite dry here most of the time. We don't usually have problems with our compost getting too wet. In coastal regions or in rainier climates, they do have that problem, and often they have to put wood over top of their compost heaps to prevent it from becoming too soggy. And you can tell that when compost gets too soggy, it starts to smell bad. It gets that sewer smell to it. And some people say, oh, I hate the smell of compost, it's so stinky, but it's not really. There's a little period right when it's first starting to break down where it gets a bit of a smell to it. Sometimes it involves some of these anaerobic bacteria. And the anaerobic bacteria, they're still breaking down the compost, but it's just a different group of bacteria, and they're the ones that give off that gas that really stinks. And it's the same ones you find in your sewer tanks as well, actually, in most cases. But can be quite stinky, but it's just a stage that happens in the early process of composting. If you keep oxygenating it, those anaerobic bacteria, they don't like oxygen. They're anaerobic. They like to be underwater in soggy conditions. So again, when you look at coastal regions or rainy climates, they suffer from that. Their compost heaps are always too wet, and they have to actually put lids on them to keep them dry. Whereas here, we actually have to put lids on them to keep them out of the sun so they don't get cooked in the sun. So what we want to do there, spray it down, keep the moisture coming, keep turning it over. And if you could turn the compost once a day, it's really surprising at how fast it breaks down. Generally, it's about 2 to 3 months, and it's getting pretty well broken down. So what I was saying about that bin system is we're going to start with bin 1, move it to bin 2, and then move it into bin 3, and it just sits for a very short period of time in bin 3, and it's usable. So you're actually using the compost that's in bin 3. So there you go. That's all the basics of that. And now I'm going to just show you some of these things, some of these different products. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how nature does it and why this is important. So ultimately, in nature, what happens is that the forest exists. There's lots of organic matter falling off the trees, its leaves and its needles and all kinds of things. And yes, pine needles are good for composting. Any kind of needles, any kind of plant material is good. So if it goes down to the ground, and then the grass that grows there, or the plants that live on the ground die, sometimes animals die, insects die, that's a living earth, there's all kinds of organic matter there, and that's all breaking down. So in the wild, what you end up with is this, and if you've ever driven down an old back road somewhere, you drive down an old dirt road, and you look at the side of the bank there, and you'll see that it's just like rock, silt, sand. It's these minerals you'll see underneath the topsoil. And that's what's underneath there. And that's what plants are used to. So they're used to having kind of not so good soil underneath. It's mostly minerals. And then you'll see on the side of the road, you'll see this little cut along the top. And sometimes it's literally only 3 or 4 inches, but sometimes it can be up to a foot. And that's your topsoil. And what that is mostly compost. And there's this little transition zone that happens at the bottom of this layer where you're starting to get a little bit of sand and silt mixed into this compost area, and it's starting to get a little bit like loam. But if that was ever scraped off with a machine, you might end up with some nice loam with some minerals mixed in with your compost. But ultimately, in the wilderness, what you'll find is sand, silt, or clay, or often giant rocks, as your subsoil. And then your topsoil will come along, and sometimes it might be sandy, or you never know, but then it transitions into this layer of compost. And nobody ever cleans up out in the wilderness, so it's years and years and years and years of composting. So the leaves are falling every year, the grass grows, it dies, the plants grow, they die, they drop leaves. This is natural. This creates natural forest litter. So every plant pretty much in the world has a natural forest litter on the surface. And that's the key, most important part. Some people say, oh, I have to dig the compost in really deep. It's like, well, you could just apply it as a mulch on the surface if you want, because that's what they're used to in nature, is that it's usually just on the top. We have that luxury sometimes of blending it in, but it's not always necessary. When we leave it on the top, it tends to break down really quickly because there's lots of oxygen and other insects and things attacking it. When you mix it in, it kind of slows it down a bit because there's less oxygen in the soil, so it slows down the breakdown. So that's where sometimes people take garden soil and mix it with their compost, and that's not usually recommended. It's better to keep your compost just on its own and don't mix anything with it. The compost has a lot more air spaces and pore spaces, and it'll break it down faster. So don't mix it with your soils until you're ready. But once you do get that and you do turn it into your soil, it actually becomes part of the soil, and hopefully there's some chunks in there and bits that are still partially decomposed. And those will gradually release their wonderful nutrients and things over a long period of time. So keep that in mind, that the only plants that really don't have much organic matter are plants that live in the desert. So we're in a semi-arid desert here, so our native plants, they don't really need to have all this fancy soil. See, they like it, but sometimes they go a little crazy and they grow too fast and spread all over the place. But they don't really need it. That's not their natural soil condition. But we're talking about perennial plants, flowers, sometimes it's cut flowers, sometimes it's our vegetable garden. Well, vegetable gardens have the highest requirement for compost out of anything. They're heavy feeders, they need lots of food and lots of compost. So when these parts and pieces of plants all start breaking down and the bacteria are consuming them, they are releasing nitrogen to the ground and to the earth, and they're also releasing all of the nutrients that plants need back to the earth. And then when we water, the water dissolves those nutrients and washes it into the root zone. So the roots can absorb all that beautiful nutrient that comes in. But it's not just that. There's organic acid. When you hear that term about humus, humus is actually that black compost. And when you take that humus and you could wring it out and get a droplet of sort of this acidic, pure, literally liquid that comes out of humus, that is humic acid. And that beautiful black acid is the secret to plant success, really. Especially these plants that love nutrients, like lots of nutrients. So what the organic acid does is it dissolves some of these minerals, the sand, silt, and clay, particularly the clay and the silt. It's so acidic, it actually breaks those little rocks down, dissolves them, and turns them into individual little micronutrients and things, and releases them into the soil so that the plants can absorb it. But it not only does that, but it coats each nutrient. And this is the key, is that you get these little micronutrients and things that the plants love, and they're coated with this organic acid. And it makes it almost slippery. Those little plants are slippery. Those little nutrients are slippery, sorry. And when you wash that acidic nutrient blend into the root zone of a plant, they can absorb it like kids eat candy. They just love it. It makes it easier. If you have the same nutrients but you don't have the organic acid, the plants can absorb it, but it's kind of difficult for them to absorb. They can do it, but it takes a while, and they need a certain amount of water that's got to keep washing in, and it's fairly good. But there's just nothing like that beautiful organic acid. It coats those nutrients and just makes them go straight into the root system super fast and easy, and it's wonderful. It's like washing down chocolate chip cookies with milk, it's wonderful. So I'm sure the plants are thinking that, but anyway, that's one of the key things. So it's not just all the nutrients that they release, it's the way that they coat the nutrients to make them easily absorbed. If you're familiar with fertilizers, you'll often see this term you'll see on if you read the label, and it'll have all the micronutrients on the label, and it'll say chelated iron or chelated boron or whatever, chelated micronutrients. That term chelated is a coating, an acidic coating that they put on those nutrients to make it easier for plants to absorb. That's why when you buy water-soluble fertilizers, they usually come with chelated nutrients, and it's easier for the plants to absorb. In nature, compost chelates the nutrients and makes them available. So that's a wonderful thing, and hopefully that's something that maybe you would take from today's class.